So welcome everyone to this webinar called Navigating the Noise, PR Strategies in the Year of Volatility. I want to introduce, first of all, my guest panelists and speakers. We have with us here today Anna Adi, who is a professor of PR and corporate communications at Quadriga University of Applied Sciences in Berlin. Anna leads the MBA Communication and Leadership at this renowned university. She's someone I've known for a few years, a great friend of AMEC, the Association of Measurement of Evaluation and Communication, and someone that I always enjoy sparring ideas with at all sorts of events. We recently met at the Eco Summit in Warsaw, and I'm sure Anna will share some of the research findings and insights that she showed us at that event as well. We also have with us today Conor Brophy, who is a managing director of consulting firm Teneo, based in Dublin, Ireland. Conor is again a friend of ours, a friend of Ruepoint. He advises clients, including domestic and high-profile international corporations in many different sectors on communication strategy, stakeholder engagement, public affairs, media relations, crisis management, everything that you can think senior leadership and big organizations really need. So I'm very pleased to have both of them join us in this webinar today. Welcome, both of you, and I really appreciate the time and effort you spent on giving us your insights and your thoughts and ideas about the topic, really, which is what is coming for us in the next 12 months and how we as PR practitioners how are we equipped to deal with those challenges, and what we should probably do to adapt to those challenges. How are we, what is our wish list when we sit at the end of this year thinking about, okay, this is what we expect, how do we prepare for all of that? So great to have you both on board. We also worth mentioning that this is a webinar part of the AMEC Measurement Month. I mentioned already, AMEC is, for those of you who don't know, the Association of Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. Each year in November, we celebrate the best achievements in measurement by organizing a series of events across the globe to celebrate the value and I guess benefits of PR measurement. We are going to talk about some of the insights that my colleagues and the friends here on the webinar have been speaking about for many months in the last 2 years. The goal is to make this session practical and interactive as we can, which is why we asked a question on LinkedIn earlier this week about questions. Give us your questions, give us your use cases and challenges, maybe things you've succeeded in, or maybe things you've failed with. So we have a few of those questions ready for our panelists later on. But in the meantime, please feel free to send us more questions in the webinar chat. For all of you who are on the webinar, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be very happy to share a link to the recording to everyone who is interested in the topic after the end of the event. So I guess before we kick off with some thoughts and insights from Anna and Conor, I'd like to just take the opportunity to set the scene, if you want, a little bit, and talk about how we see the challenge of next year and what we as a PR measurement organization, which Ruepoint is, are preparing for this challenge. It would be helpful if I introduce myself. My name is Raina Lazarova. I'm the co-founder and COO of Ruepoint, Ruepoint is a full-service media intelligence provider offering everything from media monitoring and tracking in earned and social media through to media evaluation and measurement and consultancy services for global customers. Peer measurement obviously is one of the important aspects of what we do as part of what I would like to refer to as the extended PR community. And hopefully together with Conor and Anna, we'll be able to give you an idea or maybe a different perspective, our experience, our view on how we feel and see the future in front of us as PR practitioners. To set the scene, and before we kick off with our guest panelists, a few words on the latest trends in communications. There's a lot going on, obviously, in the world in many different ways, and all that goes on in the world affects us as PR practitioners. A few of the key trends that we see in the last 12 months, and we see continuing into next year, are around the amount of data and information that is being generated on a daily basis. So it's noisy out there. Generative AI and other technologies make it even noisier and louder. And what it means for us as PR practitioners is that it will be getting harder and harder to reach our target audiences. Getting those attentions will become more difficult, it will take longer, and also making sure that we are reaching the right audiences. I'm sure that we will speak about this a lot at this webinar. How do you know that the people you are targeting, the audiences you are targeting, are actually seeing your message, that they're interacting and engaging with your campaign, with your brand, with your organization values? And a few of the trends that really define this are around the fact that there's a lot of data and content being created both by humans and non-humans, in other words, by bots. The recent research shows that although only 5% of online accounts are currently bots, they represent more than 30% of all the content and data that is being published on a daily basis. Another interesting fact or research report published by the European law enforcement group Europol recently shows that as much as 90% of online content might be synthetically generated by 2026. And synthetically generated or synthetic media refers to media generated or manipulated using some form of artificial intelligence. So if we think that it's difficult now and it's noisy and messy, what the future shows us, or the prediction is that it will get messier and it will get noisier. And this is the environment that we as PR practitioners are going to have to operate in and to continue to deliver value in to our customers or our stakeholders at large. It's interesting, one of the factors that comes out of the amount of data that is being generated on a daily basis out there, including through artificial intelligence, is the fact that that increases the risk of mis and disinformation. It's a challenge that all of us, I'm sure, have faced in some shape or form or another. It's something that all PR bodies known to me, at least, and organizations and associations have dealt with, from the PRCA, ECO, PRSA, the PRI, and all sorts of local PR bodies, EACD. It's something that we are going to have to wrestle. And I guess in that context, some key factors that are going to, or events that are going to take place next year, are going to play an even more important role when it comes to us protecting ourselves against and managing the mis and disinformation out there. The first of these factors is elections. There will be 2 billion people next year who are expected to vote. So that represents 2/3 of the citizens in all democratic countries in the world. We've seen examples in the past how that changes the context and the dynamics. And this will be, I guess, on stews next year. Those risks will be much stronger and bigger than they have ever been. We have US, UK, Taiwan, a number of key economies and powers in the world who are going to go through elections. Lastly, I just want to mention the fact that obviously it is our job as PR practitioners to manage the relationship with the media as one of many responsibilities that we have. The challenge that we have, and everyone who is trying to communicate we have, is the fact that the trust in the media as we know it is at its lowest point. Only 42% of adults trust the media. If you speak to anyone from the younger generations, maybe, younger people you hire in your businesses, you've probably seen this trend, or look at, your children, your friends' children. The way they consume news is not through what we would refer to as traditional media. There are different channels. And so that creates yet another challenge to all of us. The interest in media has dropped significantly. People are less prepared to visit media websites and read the press. And so how does that affect what we all do? Are we prepared for those trends? We no longer open the newspaper when we wake. I mean, clearly we do because of our jobs, but not everyone else does. Not all of our stakeholders and not everyone in our target audience does that every day. So I guess this makes communications more complicated in both format and segmentation, and it creates an interesting paradigm that we all need to deal with. And before we move on, I just want to remind everyone, as a kind of starting point, the purpose of communications. There are probably many views on that, but one of those possible views or definitions of communications is that PR is about communicating the right message to the right audience at the right time to achieve an objective. So there is an end goal, and then end goal is defined in different ways depending on the organization and the stakeholders. And I guess to kind of bring back the measurement discussion, knowing those stakeholders and the objectives that you're trying to achieve are an important aspect of being able to prove the value that you bring to an organization. And I'm sure both of our guest panelists, Anna and Conor, have a lot to share from their practical experience around the challenges of demonstrating that value and what does value mean? How do you define that value? I'm sure both of them will touch upon that. And with that, I would like to invite Anna Addy to present or I suppose describe her view of the situation, her view of the future, and her predictions. So please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raina. Really interesting. I've taken some notes. I mean, I know we've discussed earlier a little bit about what we think challenges are. And we've looked at the rise of generative AI and what that brings us here. But truly, our conversation went back to what is PR here for, right? And then, in a sense, the biggest challenge of measurement and evaluation goes hand in hand with what we perceive the role of public relations and comms to be. So, that as an academic, I usually say that traditionally we've seen public relations affiliated and associated and servant to an organization, right? And this is where a lot of the measurement philosophy is coming from, where we are associating success to what an organization says success is for them. But then because you've mentioned misinformation and disinformation, right? In this case, misinformation is what we don't like. So it's wrong according to how we see it, but not necessarily wrongly intentioned, whereas disinformation is there as clearly, nothing that we want, and not with the data points or the information to start with that we want, right? So one is supposed to deflect, to disinform, so confuse. The other one might be wrong by mistake. But again, how we judge misinformation and disinformation has always to do with what is the point of start. And it's the same thing with the value of public relations and comms. How do we see it as being valuable is always dependent to whom we associate it with. And newer as in, you know, post 1980s, and as we're talking about more recently, as recent as 2023, there's more and more conversation about reshaping and redefining the role of public relations and comms, and instead of putting them in the service, the immediate service of just an organization, to move that role into a facilitation of stakeholder debates. Yeah, so it means that comms isn't taking clearly a persuasive role on behalf of only one actor, but rather thinks of its legacy, so the legacy of that actor and everybody else on a long term. And obviously, if you change that point of view, when it comes to measurement and evaluation, you have two things that change. One, that all of a sudden the world for comms gets way bigger. So that means there's, again, we go back to your paradox, right? More data, oh my God, what are we going to do with it? Once this world gets bigger, though, it also means that there's more choice, and there's not always a single scenario going out. So again, for a communicator, that widening of spectrum of horizon might come with all sorts of challenging in measurement, and at times comes with conflict. So it's quite necessary, though, for communicators, I think, moving forward, and that's part of noise, that's part of what you've spoken as a topic of our conversation, this year of volatility, the fact that our stakeholders have stakeholders of their own, and then everybody might want different things, looking at the same issue, and therefore, by default, all of a sudden, the communications job is to navigate potential conflicts, as in conflicts not in full-on disagreements, but rather misalignments and lack of alignment between those objectives. And so several things I think that become really, really important. One is acknowledging that you cannot control anymore, that relationships are complex and long-term, and that comes with a level of vulnerability, but it comes also with a level of accountability. There's also an acknowledgement that win-win is not possible at all times. And for a communicator in particular, skill set wise, I think there are two essential elements that come out. One is their ability to facilitate deliberation. So if we're making a commitment to democracy, particularly in this part of the world, then the role of comms is to ensure that democratic deliberations can take place, rather than what we've seen historically. By taking the side of an organization, basically, you frustrate everybody else. That's the academic extreme, right? So instead of frustrating everybody else because we want it our way, how is it that we can deliberate so that we together find a good solution? But that also means, from a measurement and evaluation perspective, that we need to consider how do we measure long time, and how do we connect different data points and different stakeholder views. And I think that is possible, but that means that we need to move beyond campaigns. And media monitoring companies and social listening companies are fantastically well geared to listen to stakeholder environments, but that also means that clients of such businesses need to move away from this temptation right now that they have to look busy and communicate all the time, right? More data, loads of noise, and rather listen more carefully and intervene. So interfere, offer to say something when they can really contribute to furthering that cause. And just to being fully aware of time, you've mentioned technological developments, and I think on the side of tech optimists, we're excited. So there's excitement that we can target better and we can write more. On the thinking of the tech dystopians to a degree, that means that we'll be creating more content. Therefore, not only keeping ourselves way busy, hey ho, look at us, we won't be out of jobs. But the problem is going to be that the receiver end, they'll be overwhelmed, right? So we're running the risk of doing more harm and contributing to the withdrawals effects that you've already reported, right? The fact that people do not seek particular channels anymore, that there's more and more polarization in terms of how we choose our sources. So we might end up in this paradox where for a communicator to be successful, even using AI technologies to help your work, to help make it more effective, you'll be paying more and you'll be spending more time so that you find out where you find those people, those stakeholders, in a sense, opinion leaders that you would want to connect. I think it's exciting, though. I mean, to me, as someone who sits on the teaching side, but also has been engaging in research over the past years, looking into the future of comms, there are probably two things that I would see important to continue, and that is for communicators to continue to spend time in refining their research skills, whether it's, AI helped or not. It really does help to have a foundation of understanding how research works, how concepts are put together, what methods mean, because these ones are then automated, but then also you can see how you can connect those data points that in the past you were not able to. And with that, I also see a renegotiation of this role. And this is what I've mentioned earlier, right? It's not, PR is not a servant. If we're committing as a profession, all of us together, that we want to facilitate and leave a positive legacy to our colleagues, then that means that we need to fight both internally for a facilitation role, but we also need to more and more pledge externally, and that clarification of what comms is willing to do and not willing to do, so that you make that difference professionally. But that's kind of what I think, and I think it answers a little bit all these trends that you've covered. I'm really curious to know what Conor thinks about this, because he definitely has a more applied experience than mine, at least in recent years.
Thanks, Anna. Look, I'm happy to take up the baton there, and look, I think you've set out the scene between yourself and Raina really well there. And look, just to touch upon what you're saying there, how do we see our job as communications professionals? At its most evolved, it should be, to your point, as a strategic enabler. And whether you view your communications function as core to strategy formulation or not, to me is critical to achieving the outcomes that you want. And we would see best practice, certainly from my perspective, as having your comms function as a strategy maker, not as a strategy taker, right? So where it works, of course we would say that, but where it works well from our perspective is where comms is in the room from day one, actively contributing to, and I don't just mean the PR plan or the comms plan, but to the organization's strategy, and taking that medium to long-term outlook, involved in core formulation, answering key questions, working actively on things like planning, scenario planning, risk mitigation, and all of that good stuff. Rather than being handed the strategy after the fact and told, here it is, now do some comm stuff, or worse still, brought into the room when something has gone wrong and, we have a problem here, can you wave your comms magic wand and make it go away, please? And, many of us are familiar with exactly those sorts of fraught situations. But it becomes increasingly important and I think, look, the title of the webinar is really puts it really nicely. In the year of volatility, when we have so much noise, and one of the things that we've observed working with our clients and planning from our own perspective as an organization is the reasonably foreseeable future, or the time frame over which you can divine with any sense of near certainty what's actually going to happen from an economic perspective, from a policy perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, is now so narrow. Like your plans have to be both robust and, it's not paradoxical. And we're talking about a lot of different paradoxes here as comms professionals and comms adjacent professionals. At the same time, you have to build in so much agility. Like people, senior leaders, I think, are coping with almost a rolling crisis mentality ever since COVID. That everything is an issue or a crisis to be dealt with, it seems like, and that they're constantly on that in that state of preparedness, waiting for things to go wrong, anticipating that things will change, which kind of has to be built into the planning process now. You know, choose whichever cliche is most amenable to you here, but the only constant really is change, right? So all of the things that we've talked about, you know, conflict in the Middle East and in Ukraine, deglobalization, and that, you know, fracturing of the multilateral order, which had been so painstakingly constructed since the end of the Second World War, you know, the upcoming elections that you mentioned, Ryan, and how that might change, you know, policy outlook and policy in any number of very important countries. Not that all of the countries aren't important, but in terms of their geopolitical impact, I mean, and misinformation, disinformation, the presence of that capability now through generative AI and through the power of the technology to cause chaos and instability. And, you know, it's terrible as a comms professional to be looking at these things from a negative perspective. But one thing we know only too well is that it's much easier to break than it is to build. It's much easier to use these capabilities and these technologies to cause instability and to cause chaos than it is to build consensus and to build something of meaningful value. And we only need to look at those who've most successfully weaponized social media as opposed to those who've been able to use it for positive reasons to see where the balance lies at the moment. So look, in summary, the outlook I'd have going into 2024 is that it's even more uncertain and even more volatile probably than it has been over the last couple of years. That as comms professionals, what we can do about that is make sure that we're in the room from early, and that we're working with senior leadership from the ground floor, and that you go back to fundamentals, right? The task of the comms professional, to me, when it works at its best, is the more complicated things become and the more complex the external environment is, the more there's a premium on being able to simplify, and there's a premium on being able to break things down into those fundamental components, and make sure that CEOs and make sure that C-suites are making conscious and deliberate choices and understanding the potential ramifications of those and understanding the outcomes. And to your point, Anna, understanding how they impact on our stakeholders. And I think it's a really good point. And, you know, I hadn't phrased it this way before, but I'm going to steal and use that prodigiously from here on in. The impact on our stakeholders, that there are those from whom we are one step removed, which nonetheless our decisions will impact on. You highlighted at the start, Ryan, and you know, I thought the little broken heart icon was apt. As a former journalist, I kind of weep when I see the erosion of trust in media, traditional media, legacy media, whatever we want to call it. But one thing you see from the Edelman Trust Barometer and from other similar reports is trust in business is actually at a reasonably high level. And, you know, crucially, adults, you know, the people surveyed don't generally tend to see businesses as the source of misinformation in the way that they see governments and media, which is very interesting. The gap between both positive perception and the perception of, you know, culpability in the spread of misinformation is much wider and in a positive sense for business than it is for government or media. That's a privileged position, but it's also a position of some responsibility. And it raises, and I know one of the questions that came in, Raina, when you threw this open on LinkedIn, and we might get to it in a little bit, it raises that question as regards what are corporations going to do, and what are their senior leaders going to do to address that? You know, are they going to put their heads above the parapet and lead? And I talk to clients all the time, and people love to talk about leadership, but leadership is hard. You know, you put your head up and you get shot at, unfortunately. That is what happens. You know, leading is not easy. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. You know, are you going to lead, or are you going to kind of stay back in the pack? Are you going to keep your head down and hope that you don't have to take positions on some of the critical issues? And bearing in mind, you know, we're talking about deglobalization as a trend, and as we've seen over the past decade and more, taking a position in one part of the world to address one set of stakeholders can also mean that you're annoying another set of stakeholders in another part of the world, even at a basic level. If you think of the choices that the technology businesses are making at the moment regarding whether they're going to locate, for instance, if they're looking to onshore semiconductor manufacturing or move that from say China to the EU or the US, they're going to make a choice based on a number of factors, including, for instance, who has the best subsidies available. If you're deciding to choose the EU over the US, or you're deciding to choose the US over the EU, or you're deciding to choose one state over another, there are winners and losers in that. And to your point, Anna, and to what we've been saying since the start, where is comms involved in that decision? How is it advising on when those decisions are made, how we're going to engage with stakeholders, how we're going to manage expectations, and how we're going to make sure that, you know, we're maintaining the bridges that have been built, that we're not burning things down, and that we're aware that, you know, when, as we've said, the only constant is change, and we're in such a volatile environment, and we can see a change of government and policy reverse just as quickly as it's been implemented. How are we going to make sure that if in 3 or 5 years' time we need to reverse course, that we can do that in a way that is as minimally disruptive as it can possibly be given the circumstances? And that requires hard work, and it requires planning, and it requires gaming out scenarios, and it requires all the things that comms professionals are supposed to be good at. So look, the necessity for good, effective communications to me has never been higher. You know, I would close by saying, before we throw it open, and I'd be really interested in the questions and observations people have, that like there's no difference between good communications and good strategy, right? They're parts of the whole. Any good strategy needs to be communicated well and communicated effectively in order to work. So good strategy involves good communications, and also good communications is a part of good strategy. It helps you achieve your objectives. It helps, as we said, to enable the organization to do what it set out to do, to achieve its purpose and to achieve its objectives.
That's brilliant. Thanks, both of you, really. There's some really interesting pieces that we were going to try and unpack a little bit now, if that's okay. So I guess I'll start from something that Anna mentioned around us always being busy. There's this concept in PR, SOS, sending out stuff. We're constantly busy sending out stuff, and we sometimes don't have the time. The work is getting more, the information, the data, we need more resources, as you both pointed out. So I guess, what is the challenge in terms of looking at the short term? As Anna, you said previously, I've heard some of your other presentations, you talk about campaigns as hiccups. Why is it so damaging to look at our work as a series of hiccups? And the next level, obviously, is looking at it longer term. Why is it that it's so difficult? And what is it that we need to do to transition to that longer term value piece?
Yeah, I love that you picked up on my hiccup metaphor, but I hope it's kind of self-explanatory in the sense that hiccups are annoying, right? They leave you out of breath, and they leave you scrambling basically in between, right? To get to something that you consider normal. And I see the purpose of a campaign, and I see that from a measurement perspective, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you can plan it, and you can report on it, and ideally you can track it. But if you want to link it to the other things that comms says that it's doing, which is either monitor reputation, because management reputation, that's nothing. Reputation doesn't sit with us. So we can try to influence reputation by doing good things or bad things, or by doing nothing. But managing it, we cannot, right? So again, this is disruptive. Campaigns are there to flail our arms up and say, we're here, pay attention to us. But long term, it is the other things that we do, that we constantly do, and that we do between campaigns that matter when it comes to reputation. More importantly is the consistency and the constancy of what an organization does that builds trust, right? And I know you've mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer. I'm both a fan and not a fan of it, because I find from a research perspective, its questions fuzzy. It's, if I ask you about trust in government or in media, I find that you have at least 5 questions that you need to answer to yourself in your head before you figure what to answer on the item over there. So I understand the campaigns, that they're easy to measure then and there. But most of the communications campaigns claim either contribution to reputation, which is long-term and does not belong to the organization, but rather the stakeholder. It's a judgment that is stakeholder dependent. Or they look at influence on behavior, which again, doesn't sit with the organization, but rather sits with the stakeholder. So therefore, there's something that needs to be done. And it's not that complicated to build in campaigns elements that would be trackable over time. And that means, you know, that you're going to look at your campaign and what it wants to achieve, but try to put that in the context of what are the elements that are the core drivers of your trust and reputation. And when I talk about core drivers of trust, I'm actually thinking of trustworthiness. And from a research perspective, trustworthiness has to do with skill, so competence, context. So you're the right person promising to do the right thing and delivering on it. And so if we do that, then these things we can manage over time. We can see if consistently we've delivered on our promises, on the things that we can do. And we can ask our stakeholders if they think the same. And our campaigns can remind them that we're there, because it's a noisy environment, I get it, but they're not the only thing. And usually the biggest issue that communicators have had is to make that transition from the campaign, the here and now, to the long term. And so that's my biggest, you know, beef, if you want, with campaigns. The fact that they're person and they're a short moment in time, and they do not ensure neither the longevity of the team or the transition that you might have in a team, and neither the longevity of a business. And I think again, if we start looking at PR from the outside in, so what is it that you want to achieve in relation with your stakeholders, negotiating what they want and what you want, then you can go backwards and build this. And the campaign is just one point in time that takes you there.
What's your view on that, Conor? Have you, in your practice, wrestled with that challenge? Maybe even explaining to customers. I mean, part of what we do is about educating the direct stakeholders that we have. Has that come up as a challenge?
Yeah, it has. And look, to get back to where you started, it's not only difficult to decide what we should do and why, but, you know, a really important part of the planning process is deciding what we're not going to do and why we're not going to do it, right? So a lot of comms activity, a lot of poor comms activity is informed by the idea, you know, in my experience, that, oh, we need to do something. This is something, let's do this. So we'd like to engage in this sponsorship because it'll make ourselves feel good about ourselves. It'll make our brand very visible. It'll, you know, we can convince ourselves that it's the right thing to do. We'd like to profile our CEO or senior leadership team because we need to move the dial right now, and we need to raise awareness of what they are and put a human face on the company. We'd like to do this brand campaign at the moment, but some of those things can be ad hoc and they can be disconnected, and they're not always, you know, to what we were talking about earlier, connected into, well, what is the strategic rationale for this? What outcome are we actually trying to achieve, and how is this going to move the dial over a longer period of time? And one of the frustrations I think we often have with measurement is we're maybe starting 2 chapters further along in the book saying, oh, how are we improving sentiment, to your point, Anna? You know, how are we improving our brand score, all that sort of stuff, when we haven't actually looked at a more fundamental level at, well, who are our stakeholders and what do they think of us today? Because to your point, and it's so important to understanding all of this, you know, letting go of that idea that we control our own reputation, when, you know, as you adroitly said, Anna, it belongs to our stakeholders. They're the ones that determine our reputation. So if we don't know, A, who they are, and B, what they think of us today, we haven't mapped that out. If it's all kind of intuitive and it's all a gut shot, then, you know, we're trying to hit a moving bullet with another moving bullet. We're having to solve for 2 very complicated trajectories, you know, and you've got to start with capturing where we're at today from a reputational perspective before you know where you're moving the needle from. Like, yes, you're moving it, but you're not necessarily sure where you're moving it from, never mind where it's going to, if you haven't captured that from the start. And you'd be surprised at how many organizations don't do that. They have a general view of who their stakeholders are, and they may have thought from a networking perspective and from an engagement perspective how they get to some of them, but they haven't really mapped it out or prioritized it, or even talked in a structured way to those stakeholders to determine, well, where do you think of us across the things that are important to us? So you control your reputation, but we control our strategies. These are the things we're trying to achieve. How does that map with how you view us today? And you know, you're essentially asking them to teach you how you should talk to them, and that then helps you solve for the sort of tactics you should use and informs the planning process in a meaningful way. Maybe they don't care about seeing your name emblazoned on the shirt of whichever hockey team, camogie team, soccer team you want to put it on, maybe that's not going to be meaningful for them. It might make you feel good, but maybe it isn't making them feel good. You know, we sometimes tend to underestimate how sophisticated our stakeholders are and think that they're going to like something when they can see through it for what it is. People can see greenwashing and people can see badging for what it is. You know, stakeholders are very sophisticated, and you only can see where you're trying to get them to if you know where they are today and you know what their views are, and that takes time and it takes investment. But it informs much better measurement and evaluation of campaigning after the fact, and it should also inform what you are and what you aren't doing in the first place.
Wait, Raina, if I may, and to your point, Conor, I mean, one of the promises of generative AI and bots, and more importantly, conversations of where the skill set and strength of vendors in this social media and media listening space comes from, is exactly in their ability to listen. And I think to a degree, services, particularly in this area, would need to be shifted rather than focus. I mean, yes, monitoring is important, but I think even more important is the ability to pick up on emerging trends and emerging discourses and narratives in environments that you're monitoring online, where there's more history, for instance, than any bot could currently give, right? Because you have that history. So in that sense, right now we go back to what Jim McNamara was talking about at the AMEC Summit in Miami, right? Where the recommendation is to turn the focus of the organization and their approach to measurement and evaluation to have a continuous process of measurement, evaluation, and learning, something that he calls it MEL. But also, to Conor's point, I think what's important is to shift this backwards and to start with insight, to say we're not doing anything, we're not engaging in any campaign until we know what our benchmark is, until we know where we are. Equally, when it comes to measurement and evaluation and thinking in this listening vein, the more generic your case might be as an organization, to a degree, the easier mapping out your stakeholders would be in very, very general, so big groups would be using bots. So that's useful. However, no organization is like another, and context is key. And just in a few days ago in our courses here at Quadriga, we had a guest who works for an organization where they need to deal with public projects. So they need to get public agreement on whatever they might be building. And it's fantastic because they came into the classroom and they showed us a photo of 5 people. It's a photo of 5 people, right? With the background, with a stage, and you can look at it, and an AI would look at it, and it might be able to tell you, oh, based on this reverse search, this is who is in the photo. However, without having the experience of the business, you're not going to know that those people represented in the photo might be part of all your stakeholder groups, but at the same time, they themselves, one person, might be actually representing 3 stakeholder groups in the different capacities, right? Is invited to be a member of a board of something, it's part of a whatever coalition, and they're conflictual within themselves. So all of a sudden, as a communicator, that's where you need to decide, how do you approach this? The sheer presence of someone at such an event, it can be a signal both for support as well as disagreement. How do you deal with that? And there's no AI at this point that is going to give you that. More importantly, with social media listening and whatever some of you do, you'll be able to unpick and see the signals online, like Anthony again and Cousins pointed out in his example at the AMEC Summit. The fact that when it came to the bank in Silicon Valley, the one that collapsed in the summer, signals online happened way sooner. It's just that the way the comms department worked is that it worked for a Monday to release news, whereas all the conversation had happened on a different platform over the weekend. So listening is highly, highly important. I just think if we focus on paying attention to what goes on and not sticking anymore to this idea that the linear process from sender to receiver, but rather acknowledge that there's an entire messiness going on that can be measured. But it needs a change of perspective from the outset of how we set up our own listening and our own insight and measurement. And that is, instead of thinking if this, then that, I'm going to do this and this way, we need to think in terms of what if. So I'm going to start this. Yes, I know. I kind of know where I want to get, but what if, right? And what if means that we're considering all these stakeholder views. And that means that we need to sit down with our teams. We need to write them down. We need to sit up with our vendors so that we can know how to mitigate for those what ifs. And we're open to all these possibilities. Does it give us more work to do? Yeah, in a different way. So we won't be talking as much as we've done before, but we would certainly be paying more attention, and that's probably more valuable than having all the materials in the world flooding everywhere and then being upset that nobody reads them.
That's a very interesting point, Anna, that you're making, and I will come back to the scenario planning in a bit. I'm just keen to make sure I can ask a couple of the questions that we received from our LinkedIn campaign, and I will start with one from my AMEC fellow board director and head of research and insight at Cometric, Maya Koleva, who is asking the following question. In a volatile age, narratives are often based on misleading, false, and even harmful information. They can affect brand reputation. Brands can try with reactive debunking and hope it may reach the magnitude of the narrative that it intends to disprove. So what about proactive pre-bunking as a comms tactic? How can we best measure the effect of that if we were to engage in what Maya refers to as proactive pre-bunking? Is that something that has come up, occurred to you, or you are probably working on?
I can jump in there, Raina, first, if that's okay. I mean, yes, to your point, I suppose you could argue that a lot of what we do is pre-bunking, right? When you're engaging in a proactive comms strategy, or when you have a campaign ongoing, your ability to withstand a reputational attack, and your ability to navigate through the environment that we're now entering in, and we've talked about the capability of generative AI, and we've talked about the capability to weaponize social media and so on. But it comes back to the investment you've made in building your reputation in the first place. We know how long that takes, and we know how quickly it can be lost. But my proclivity to believe or disbelieve something that any organization says, ultimately comes down to the relationship that I've had with them. What sort of investment have they made in building their brand, how their brand looks and feels to me as somebody engaging with it, whether as a customer or as an external observer, even if I'm not directly availing of the product or service that particular organization is providing, and all of that positive reputational capital that you've built up, right? So that I think is going to be your starting point. And there's probably a whole webinar in this in and of itself, right? But we often talk about, and we have to, because you can't differentiate one from the other, right? There isn't the digital world and the real world. It's all one and the same. And the mistake that we can often make is to say, well, that's just online. Well, it's not, because it has real world consequences. Of course it does. But we've allowed, and you only need to read a book like Norina Hertz's The Lonely Century, or look at the epidemic of loneliness that we have, and look at, it's not just governmental, but it's corporate culpability in that as well. We see, we know this well from an Irish perspective. If you look around Dublin and you look at the massive success that our industrial policy has had here in attracting multinationals, and the gleaming office blocks that I can look out the window here and see, and it's not just here, it's in many other locations around the world where you have large offices that are cut off from the communities in which they're situated in. If you bring your people into a big gleaming glass office block, or and as we've seen during COVID now with remote working and hybrid working, if people are located at home in front of their screen, how well plugged in is your organization to the real world around it, and how are you building up that reputational capital within the community in which you're physically located? If all your people come in and eat in the canteen, and they avail of snacks in your office all day long, if they're literally, their only experience of the community around them is their commute to and from, and the brief period that they spend passing through it before they park their bike, or when they get off their bus and walk from the bus stop or from the train stop to the office, then you're missing a massive opportunity to integrate with the world around you. And if you're not advocating actively for third spaces where people can connect with one another, where people from different backgrounds can connect one another, right? This is the advantage that we've lost from real life. Why do people go into the echo chamber? Because it's nice and comforting to hear your views not challenged, and to hear people repeat and echo what you're saying all day long. The parent of a teenager, I'm sure other people on the call probably are in a similar situation. I have my views challenged all day long, and it's not comfortable, right? Your teenager constantly questions everything you do or say. People long for the comfort of the echo chamber, but because a lot of the time it's an easy default option, because we've lost the opportunity and we've lost the spaces and we've lost the opportunities in which people can engage with those from different backgrounds, from different cultures, even of different ages. I was only thinking about this recently, having been at a wedding, and a very enjoyable wedding it was too. When you go to a wedding, you meet people from all sorts of different walks of life in a way that you're not necessarily doing in your day-to-day interaction, where we often are surrounded by people who come from broadly similar backgrounds to us. We engage with professionals who are from broadly similar career path, and that can be very comforting, but it can also be very damaging. So, in a long-winded way, what I'm saying is you need to think about this in a holistic sense. What are all your touch points with the world around you, and how are you building up that? Communications is both sword and shield, as we know. How are you building up your defenses? How are you improving your capability to respond to an external attack, or to respond to misinformation and disinformation? And there may be ways of doing that, and there may be effectively things that you're leaving on the table because you just haven't considered how best to leverage them, and they're all around you. If you think in a really deep and holistic way about all the ways that you interact with your stakeholders and all the ways that you engage with the community around you, you'd be surprised how much you can do to build that capital up to a point where it's not impervious to attack, and you'd be complacent to say that would ever be the case. But when you're in a much better position to debunk, and where you've effectively pre-bunked by this long investments that you've made.
And I guess, Conor, from what you just said, one of the skills that we should be looking at as organizations who kind of breed and nurture communicators is that social awareness, right? And a lot of what we do is based on our understanding and empathy of the stakeholders we are communicating with or targeting. And that aspect that you just described is probably less thought about, but is one of the risks we should be thinking about.
Well,
right?
it's one thing that I've often thought is that communications and economics have the opposite problem, right? Economics had these really robust models that kind of didn't always fare well when you applied them in the real world, and that led to the development of behavioral economics. Communications is kind of coming from the opposite perspective, whereas we tend to be, by the nature of what we do, really good at understanding the behavioral aspect, understanding how narrative follows, understanding how people are going to react, understanding how politicians are going to react to certain things, and how we need to manage their expectations. We don't always necessarily have the robust model behind it. We kind of know what we're doing, but it's harder to explain or to root in data and stats and evidence, and we're building it from the opposite direction that economics as a discipline has.
That's fascinating. I'm sure the academic on the webinar has something to say about it.
Well, I've taken some notes, as the academics do. As you talked about pre-bunking and debunking, of course, I think at the work that John Cook has done around misinformation and climate change. So there we're looking at psychology, and we're looking at a lot of rhetorical mechanisms through which misinformation is happening, and disinformation. And if you have the time, I play with my students, so every time we meet in the summer, I get them to download the Cranky Uncle app. If you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend it. Well, you won't see it on your screen, but the Cranky Uncle app basically identifies the methods, the rhetorical methods of denial, and there are 5 of them. Fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And then there are loads of other examples through it. And basically, you need to get this uncle on the app as annoyed as possible, which means that you're able to identify, to pick misinformation and disinformation. And it gets fairly easy. I mean, stuff that we think is obvious, but then it gets really, really complicated. And that requires knowledge of understanding. Now, here's the problem with pre-bunking. Debunking, in order to work, needs a mental frame. And in order to work means that through the work that we do, we replace an existing mental frame with another. Traditional communications research in the past, crisis comms, right? I mean, probably your comms training, crisis comms training is similar to mine. We were told, so when I was in school, we were told, never ever, don't you dare, you know, when you're in a press conference and you've done something wrong, don't you dare repeat the nasty question that a journalist might ask you, right? Because that's initially confirming. And that's wrong. According to debunking science, by not repeating that frame, in order to highlight it, yeah, circle it, and then explain very clearly why it's wrong, and therefore take it out and put something else back in, you're leaving the effects of that miss, if you want, lingering in the brain. So in order for debunking to work, you need to replace an existing construct with something else. So whatever Maya wants to do, she's actually bunking, right? There's no pre-bunking. She wants to set particular images in someone's particular images or constructs into someone's memory so that they get recognized, and they get recognized to be correct. What Maya also wants, and that's also every other second organization out there, is that there's no contestation. So nobody puts their hand up and says, you're wrong. I don't like what you're saying. But guess what? If we're committing, again, we go back to the role of comms. If we're committing to comms, contributing to deliberative societal processes and to democracy, we got to live with that. The only option that we have is that debunking needs this replacement of mental frameworks, also needs factual checkers. So this is where coalition building comes in place for communicators. And you need repetition, and that's no matter how annoying it might be, in this case you need higher frequency and volume. You need to float basically out something that is incorrect, but you need to point it out of why is it factually incorrect and justify it proper, so that, you know, it sticks. And I know you're going to say, but what are we going to do? Because a lot of the misinformation and disinformation out there goes on these emotional aspects of our communication, so on the irrationality of humans. Again, it goes back to, if you know what the rhetorical method of that is, then you know what the appropriate response is. But no matter what it is, you need to replace that existing thing that you think is wrong with really thorough arguments and give valid responses that you know, emotionally tap into and address the disquiet, if you want, that you've seen before. So keep on doing what you're doing, build coalitions, and enable for that conversation to happen rather than stifle it. Because usually what we've seen in research around propaganda, and not only propaganda, communications that we've seen around systems that were highly policed, is that once you try to control something way too hard, you're going to have different avenues in which these are going to happen. Raina, you and I grew up in communist countries. You should know what we talk about. You have an emergence of double speak and of parallel sort of speak. And that's exciting from a creative point of view, but from a communicator point of view, that's even more destabilizing, because long-term it means that you're building a threshold for distrust instead of starting with a societal threshold for trust. So I like that idea. I know where the thinking is coming from. I would just say, keep on doing what you're doing, consistently what you're doing, making sure that it links as you've promised, deeds, words and deeds, that they work together with one another, and then pre-bunking is not your problem.
That's fascinating, Anna. I really appreciate those thoughts. We've barely scratched the surface here, and we've run out of time. So we might want to do another webinar. As Conor said, there's plenty of material here. Just one last question from me, I guess, for both of you. If you had 2 PR predictions for the next 12 months, what would they be? The first one, what would you bet your house on that will happen? And the second one is a curveball that may come true. So what would those PR predictions be from in your mind? What are you preparing for?
Conor, you go first because I'm not willing to bet my house on right now.
I've got two, and I'm not sure whether how much I'm willing to bet on either of them. But look, if we put one in the relatively safe category, one of the things that interested me during this year is we saw a couple of transactions where professional services firms merged and where we've seen comms integrated into either a legal or a consulting practice, which I thought was fascinating. You might have seen that the UK law firm Schillings acquired a PR firm called Portland in September, which, you know, reflected their acknowledgement that sometimes you need to advise clients in a different way on things that are reputationally impactful. I think defamation was the obvious kind of link up there, and that makes perfect sense. But I think I'd be surprised if we got through 2024 without seeing some M&A in that space, and maybe a couple of significant transactions where you see, you know, professional services firms from different backgrounds looking to integrate comms into their advisory. Teneo, we've kind of done it from the other side, but it's interesting that it's now happening in that direction too. The other one, and maybe this is the curveball one, is I think we'll see the first, and I hope I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure we're going to see the first significant reputational issue caused by a deep fake or caused by generative AI next year. It has to be just around the corner.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that.
I don't really know. I go back. I mean, all these issues and scenarios that you're pointing towards. To me, I'm kind of thinking, what am I seeing in the classroom and in my conversations? So it's a really anecdotal experience, but I think there's a great discrepancy right now, at least in the world of comms, between those who have had experience with AI and many who don't. And that's the same when it comes to research, and, you know, asking research questions, actually asking stuff and promising things that we can measure, and that is independent of AI or not. AI to me is the newest, you know, most glittery tool that we have, and of course where the shiny object effect is there. But I think for comms, end of 2024, we're still going to discuss about comms' seat at the table, and the fact that with AI or without AI, there are people out there, some of them in management positions, who think that comms is something that anyone can do. And I think that's historically inherited. Again, it's a conversation for a different time. But I think until we make the difference between talk as comms and strategic organized persuasion, as we've spoken, in the minds of others, not those who go to school and make this, you know, a business, a life, a career, until we don't get that sorted, I think we're still going to have those sorts of conversations. So maybe not technology, but sort of old habits that die hard. And this belittling of comms that everybody can do it, I think it's here. It's a fight that we'll have to keep on fighting for quite a bit.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna Adi of Quadriga University and Conor Brophy of Teneo in Dublin. Thank you everyone for all your questions and for listening to us. Maybe there's another webinar coming down the line. I would love for that to happen. In the meantime, enjoy your evening. Thank you for joining Ruepoint and AMEC. And if you're interested in joining AMEC as a member, please visit the AMEC website. There's plenty of benefits for everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Raina.
Thanks,
Great meeting you.
You're very welcome.